because we're not going to have a DAF on Tisha B'Av, we're actually going weiter. Rabbi Torchiner was kind enough to move an Amud ahead yesterday, so we're now on DAF Chaf Dalet Amud Beis, on the third line of DAF Chaf Dalet Amud Beis. And we're going to do most of DAF Chaf Hey today as well. And this way, that'll place us a DAF ahead. So tomorrow we'll do the remainder of Chaf Hey and DAF Chaf Vav, which will be Tisha B'Av's DAF. Okay? So let's take a look now. We're in the middle of a drasha where Chazal are trying to, there's a number of different opinions as to how I learned that there is an Isser Hana'ah in addition to an Isser Achila when the Torah says don't eat something. And remember, we had started off this discussion several days ago, and we were in the middle of a pasuk which is in Vayikra Perek Zayin, which says V'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel. Flesh that touches anything that is tamei may not be eaten, ba'eshi sareif, it must be burned in fire. The Gemara had said, if you already tell me that it has to be burned in fire, does that not imply that it may not be eaten? So the words lo ye'achel are superfluous, and their superfluousness is to teach me that any other time when the Torah says that there's an Isser Achila, it's also coming to teach me an Isser Hana. That was the whole purpose of us bringing in this pasuk in the first place. So now the Gemara asks a question, V'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel dereishe dekra lamali. Why does the Torah have to use the way, there's a number of ways of learning this, but the way the second pshat in Rashi asks it is, why is it that there's an extra letter vav on the word basar? It says veha basar, which it's not adding to anything, so why does the Torah have to use that extra letter vav? L'rabos eitzim u'levonim. That comes to tell me that not only is meat subject to becoming tamei in the Beis HaMikdash, but even non-edibles, as we've seen previously, because of chibas kodesh, because of the endearment that we have for holy things, even non-edible items can be makabel tuma, such as the firewood and the frankincense. Now, v'habasar kol tahar yochal basar d'seifa lamali. Now, the next part of the pasuk says that anything that is tahor may be eaten. So there too, the extra letter vav on the word vehabasar, what is that coming to teach me? L'rabos emurim is coming to teach me that when emurim, which are the kishkas of the animal that are meant to be burnt on the altar, when those are consumed in a state when they have become in contact with tumah, so then there's an additional violation. Now let's be clear. Any person who eats the kishkas that are supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach, even if that person is a kohen, is in violation of a mitzvah slo saseh, because since it's meant to be burnt on the Mizbeach, no one is allowed to eat something that's meant to be burnt on the Mizbeach. If you do that, you commit a mitzvah slo saseh of eating that which is Hashem's portion. But the extra letter Vav teaches me over here that there's an additional mitzvah slo saseh that you would incur if those emurin were tamei. And that is that even though they're not normally meant to be eaten, but if you do go ahead and eat them, you incur an additional mitzvah slo saseh of eating the that which has become tamei, that which is kodshim. So the Gemara says, emurim mehasam nafka. But one second, I already have a different pasuk to teach me that when emurim are eaten in a state of tumah, that a person is liable. Because the Tanya, Behanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashalamim asher lashem, that if a person shall eat from the flesh of sacrifices, which is asher lashem, and that those two words are extraneous. Asher lashem is implicit. If it's a korban, of course it's asher lashem. So therefore, l'rabos is ha'imurim. Therefore, that comes to tell me that not only if you eat the flesh of the animal, but even if you eat its intestines, its kishkas, there too, you're also going to incur an infraction if you eat it in a state of tumah. So the Gemara says, so if you already have a pasuk to tell you that eating a murin in a state of tumah is asur, why do you need our pasuk? Answers the Gemara, hasam tumas aguf bekares, hacha tumas basar belav. The answer is that there are two different isurim. One is when the meat is tamei, and one is when the person is tamei. When the person is tamei and he eats a murim, so then he gets kares, and that's what the Brisa was coming to tell me. But our teaching from this pasuk is of viha basar, is when the meat itself is tamei and I'm tahor. So there, I don't get kares, but I get a regular mitzvah losase. I get another set of lashes for having eaten the emurim. Okay, that concludes the Gemara's discussion about the pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin, which was, according to one opinion, the source text for how I know the Isser Hana'ah for things that are forbidden for Achila. We're now going weiter. Now a totally new discussion. Amar Rabbi Avahu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Kol Isurin Shebetorah Ein Loken Alehen Ela Derech Achilasan. That when the Torah prohibits the consumption of a food item, you only are going to be liable if you consume it in its normative fashion. Lima'ute mai, what does that come to exclude? Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, lima'ute she'im achal chelav chai shepater. We know the Torah prohibits me from eating forbidden fat, which we call chelev. If I go ahead and I eat it raw, so that I'm going to be exempt from the Isser, I won't get kares for that because I ate it in a non-normative way. Ika da amre, others learn that this statement was not made just on the things that are forbidden for eating, but Amar Rabbi Avahu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Yisurin Shebetorah Ein Loken Aleim Ela Derech Hana'asan. That when it comes to the prohibited substances where the Torah prohibits even their hana'ah, I only incur the penalty, I only get the infraction of malchus if I benefit from them in their normative fashion. So the difference between the first version and the second version is the first version was limited to eating, and here the second version is talking about just general benefit. Lema'ute mai, what does that come to exclude? Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, lema'ute she'im heiniach chelev shel shor haniskal al gabi makaso shehu pater. So one thing it's coming to exclude is if I take the fat of a shor haniskal, so that's asur bahana because the animal has to be put to death, and we learned previously that any ox that gored that is to be put to death, the flesh of that animal and all the components of that animal are asur bahana. So if I go ahead and I get hana from that animal, I'm in violation. But what if I do it in a non-normative fashion? I take the fat of the animal, and instead of using it in its normative use, which Rashi says, what do you normally use animal fat for? You use it to process hides. What you do is I don't know what the process of tanning is, but they have to use some kind of fat in order to be able to process the hide. And instead of using it for the hide, I take it and I take raw fat and I place it on a wound as some kind of dressing for my wound. So since that's a non-normative benefit, I'm going to be pater from the Isser of Hana. I'm not going to get malchus for that. V'chol shekain, ochel chelav chai shehu pater. And then surely, when it comes to eating, since I'm eating it in a non-normative fashion, I'm going to be pater as well. Excuse me. Itmar nami, Amar Rav Acha bar Ivya, Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. This was also stated by these Amoraim. Hiniach chelev shel shor haniskal al gabe makaso pater lefisha kol yisurin shebetorah in loken aleim ela derech hana'asa. That if you place the fat of a shor haniskal, of an animal that's to be executed, and that's therefore its fat is asur bahana, and you place it on a wound as a dressing, so then you're going to be pater, because when it comes to any isser in the Torah where the benefit is prohibited, you're only going to get malchus if you get a normative benefit, but for a non-normative benefit, you're not going to incur the Torah penalty. Now, it still may be asur, it still may be rabbinically asur, but that's we're not dealing with that right now. Amar Reb Zera afana nomi tanina. We learned similarly. Ein sofkin es ha'arboim mishum orla ela al hayotzim min hazeisum min ha'anovim. Reb Zera wants to demonstrate that fact from the following brisa. He says the brisa teaches me that I only get malchus if I eat orla produce. If I eat orla produce that is converted into juice when it's only grape juice and olive juice or olive oil, meaning that the only things that are harvested from the fruit of orla that are subject to giving me malchus are only grape juice or wine or olive oil, but anything else not. So the Gemara says bilvad v'ilu mitusim tenim v'rimonim lo. So we can infer from there that if I drink the juice of berries, of figs, and of pomegranates, so then I'm not going to get malchus for that. So what's the reason for that? My time, alav mishum deloka achaluhu derech hana'asan. We can infer from this the same principle, because I'm not eating the fruit or the berry in its normative fashion, because normatively, the only fruit that is grown for its juice and not for itself are grapes and olives. Other fruit, you don't grow them for their juice. Let's say I drink that pomegranate juice, right? So pomegranate drink. If I drink that's orla. According to this, I'm not going to get malchus because you didn't plant the pomegranate tree for its juice. You planted it for its produce. And since, therefore, you're benefiting from it in its non-normative or unintended use, you're not going to get malchus for it. So that's what we want to try and argue. But Amarle Abaya, no. Abaya says, I disagree, and I feel that that's not the correct way to interpret the Brisa. Because Bishlama Iashmi'inan Prigufa de Lokachale Derechana Aso Shapir. It's one thing if you would have brought me a brisa that tells me that if I eat the fruit itself in a non-normative fashion, let's say I cook the fruit instead of eating it raw, and that brisa would have told me that I don't get malchus for that, then I think you would have proved your point. However, Elahacha Mishum Dezeya Ba'almahu. But here, perhaps the reason why you don't get malchus for drinking the juice is because the juice is not considered to be the fruit at all. The juice is considered to be a byproduct, what we call zeya ba'alma. It's just the perspiration of the fruit, so to speak. In other words, the only time when we consider the juice of the fruit an actual part of the fruit is when it's grape and olives, because there the juice is the ultimate objective. But here, the liquid that oozes from a fruit is not the ultimate objective, and therefore maybe it's not even considered to be orla at all. Maybe it's not part of the thing that the Torah prohibits. And that's the reason why I don't get malchus. So you can't prove the point that you were trying to make. You can't prove that you don't get malchus for a non-normative benefit of a prohibited substance, because maybe this was never the substance that the Torah prohibited in the first place. Amar Abaye. Abaye then makes another statement, and he says, Hakol modim bekilei hakerem shalokin aleim afilu shaloka derechana asa. Everyone agrees that when it comes to kilei hakerem, now kilei hakerem is when you mix wheat seeds and vines together and growing together, that even when you benefit from that forbidden mixture in a non-normative fashion, you're going to get punished. My time mishum delo ksif behu achila. And the reason is because the whole concept of being potter from a non-normative benefit is because the Torah prohibits the hana'ah by writing the verb achila. And since achila implies a normative benefit, because you eat things normally to benefit from them, so therefore we learn that if you benefit from something in a non-normative fashion, it's not like achila, and therefore you're going to be potter. But what if the Torah prohibits kilei hakerem bahana'ah without using the verb achila? So based upon that, you're still going to be liable even if you benefit from it in a non-normative fashion. Now, the Torah, when it talks about kilayim, it just says pentikdash hamaleya, that the growth that results from mixing wheat and vines together is going to be sanctified. And from there we learn that not only is aser ba'achila, but it's also aser ba'hana, just like anything that's hektish. So since the source text does not use the verb of achila, we can derive from there that even a non-normative hana'ah makes you punishable. So Meis ve'isi ben Yehuda Omer, so we're going to challenge that from the following brisa. We challenge it. The Isi ben Yehuda says, Minayin lebasar b'chala of shehu aser. How do you know that when you cook milk and meat together, that you're not allowed to eat it? You're not allowed. It's a forbidden substance. Now, we have a different way. The normal way that we understand that it's aser ba'achil and aser ba'hana is based upon another drasha that the Gemara makes elsewhere. It says, Lo sevashel gedi b'chalev imo 3 times in the Torah. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. That verse is said 3 times in the Torah, and from there we learn that one is for the isser of bishul, you can't cook it together. One is you can't eat the cooked substance, and you cannot benefit from the cooked substance. But that's only one interpretation. The Gemara over here is going according to Isi ben Yehuda, who says, look, all the Torah says is that you can't cook it. How do you know that you can't eat it once it's cooked? So Nemar kan ki am kadosh atav, and Nemar lahalan ve'anshe kodesh tiyun li, ma lahalan aser afkan aser. He says, look, there's a scriptural connection between basar b'chalav and treifa. The Torah says you have to be holy people in both verses. So we learn that therefore, just like treifa is aser b'achila, you're not allowed to eat it, so too basar b'chalav, you're not allowed to eat it. Ve'ein li ela ba'achila ba'ana minayin. And that only tells me that I can't eat basar b'chalav. How do I know that I may not even benefit from basar b'chalav when I'm not eating it? So here it's amart kal v'chomer. You can say a kal v'chomer. Uma orla shelo nevda ba'avera asura b'hana basar b'chalav shenevda ba'avera eno din sheyasur b'hana. So the Brisa initially wants to make a kal v'chomer from the isser of orla. Orla is something that when you plant a tree, you're not doing anything forbidden, and yet the Torah says that the product of that tree for the first 3 years, which is orla, is going to be asur. So surely in a situation where you're able to get a product only through doing a forbidden act, surely that product should be asur b'hana. Basar b'chalav, you only get that product of basar b'chalav by doing the forbidden act of cooking. So therefore, it stands to reason that if orla is asur b'hana, then surely basar b'chalav should be asur b'hana. But the Gemara wants to challenge, the Brisa challenges that, and it says, Ma'ala orla shekein lo haisa lo sha'asa kosher. But perhaps there's a reason to be more machmir in regard to orla, because orla is a product that never was permitted. Whereas by basar b'chalav, when you mix it initially, it's still not a forbidden substance. It's still permitted even after mixing it. It's only after it cooks together that it becomes a forbidden substance. So therefore, the thinking that the Gemara has at this point is that maybe there's more reason to be lenient by basar b'chalav, because since the two components were at one time permitted, and only later they become forbidden, they're not as stringent, with no reason to be stringent as we should by orla. But Tomar b'basar b'chalav shalish lo sha'as kosher. So the Gemara answers. So the Gemara says, Chametz b'Pesach yochiach. No, we can prove it from Chametz on Pesach. Shahayelo shasa kosher, that Chametz before Pesach is permitted, and only on Pesach it's forbidden. So that too is something that's considered to have a shasa kosher. It has a time when it's initially forbidden, and then later it becomes prohibited. And therefore, we can make a kal v'chomer from chametz on Pesach. If chametz on Pesach, which has the sha'as kosher, and it was not the chametz product was not created through any forbidden act. Nevertheless, once Pesach comes, it's asur b'hana. So then, surely basar b'chalav, which was created through a forbidden act, surely that should be asur b'hana. So the basar b'hana. So the Gemara now asks, "Malu chametz b'Pesach shekein anish kares, tamar b'basar b'chalav sheino anish kares." But then the Brisa asks, "But wait a minute. Maybe the reason for being machmir for chametz on Pesach is because you get kares for that, for its consumption, and maybe that's the reason it's asur b'hana. But basar b'chalav, which you don't get kares for its consumption, maybe there should be no asur hana." So then the Brisa says, "Okay, fine. So let's go to kilei hakerem yochichu." She'ein anush kares va'asur b'hana. That's the conclusion of the Brisa. The Brisa's final conclusion is, let's learn it out from kilei hakerem, from kilayim. What do you learn from kilayim? You don't get kares for consuming kilayim, and yet it's asur b'hana. So do the same thing for basar b'chalav. That you don't get kares for it, and yet it should be asur b'hana. The Gemara now says, but based on this brisa, we can ask a question on the previous statement. You just got through telling me that kilei hakerem is going to be asur b'hana even when the benefit is non-normative. V'im isa nifroch mala kilei hakerem sheken loken aleyam afilu shelo kederach hana asan. He says maybe you can ask a similar question for kilayim. Just like you rejected orla and you rejected chametz b'Pesach because they have their own unique stringency that makes them no longer comparable to basar b'chalav, say the same thing for kilayim. Maybe kilayim has a separate stringency in the sense that you incur an infraction even when you benefit from kilayim in a non-normative fashion. So maybe that's why we're more machmir and we asur it b'hana, and therefore you can't apply that issue to basar b'chalav. So that's the question on Abaya. But Abaya will answer and tell you as follows: V'Abaya Tomar, what kind of challenge are you going to provide? B'mai Tomar, what is the challenge? B'basar b'chalav shein loken alav ela derech hana aso, that basar b'chalav is different from kilayim because basar b'chalav, you only get malchus if you benefit from it in a normative fashion, whereas kilayim you get malchus even if you benefit in a non-normative way. Atu b'basar b'chalav achila ksiva bei. Wait a minute, since basar b'chalav also is one of those prohibited substances which the Torah prohibits it without telling you the word achila. Remember, the whole premise of this Gemara is that when the Torah says don't eat it, and that applies to an Isser Hana'ah, we derive that the only time there's an Isser Hana'ah is if you're benefiting from it in a normative fashion. But if the Torah doesn't use the word achila, then so then you would derive, just like by kilayim, that it's prohibited even when the benefit is non-normative. Well, that's true by basar b'chalav as well. By basar b'chalav, the Torah doesn't use the word achila. So therefore, there's no reason to suggest that it's any different from kilayim. Just like by kilayim, the isser hana is even when it's non-normative, so too by basar b'chalav, the isser will be when it's non-normative. So basar b'chalav is perfectly analogous to kilayim, and that's why it is an apt analogy that once I know that kilayim is asr b'hana, so too basar b'chalav is also going to be asr b'hana. Wayne? Sorry, it's a little distracting. Sorry. Okay. V'idach de kamosiv la. So now the person who asked the question, he asked the question by saying, look, I have a problem that you're comparing kilayim to basar b'chalav. That's not an apt analogy. So what was his thinking? And as Aryai just demonstrated, that basar b'chalav is also going to be asr b'hana in a non-normative way. He says, lahachi kagomer minavela, manavela derech hana asa, af basar b'chalav derech hana asa. His feeling is that, look, we just demonstrated that we learned that there's an Isser Achila because the Torah makes a scriptural connection between Basar B'chalav and Treifa. That just like by Treifa there's an Isser Achila, so too by Basar B'chalav there's an Isser Achila. Once the Torah is making the comparison to Treifa, then we could argue that just like by Treifa the Isser Achila is when it's done in a normative fashion, so too by Basar B'chalav the Issers of both Achila and Hana will only be done when it's in a normative fashion. So that's why the questioner brought this brisa in to begin with, because he wanted to try and prove that there's no apt analogy that can be made between basar b'chalav and kilayim, according to Aryai, because basar b'chalav is only asr derech hana asa in a normative way, and kilayim is asr even in a non-normative way. Ve'Aryai lahachilo kasav achila begufo lomer shalokan alav afilu shaloka derech hana asa. So the Abaya's response to that is that, look, even though it's true that the Torah makes a scriptural connection between basar b'chalav and treifa, but nevertheless, the verb achila is not implemented when the Torah tells me the isser of basar b'chalav. The fact that the Torah doesn't use the verb achila in and of itself indicates that even when you benefit from it in a non-normative way, you're going to be liable. So now the Gemara asks, but now let's go back to another issue that we had raised along the way. We had said in the Brisa that Orla is different from Basar B'chalav. Why? Anyone remember why Orla is different from Basar B'chalav? Orla is something Shalohai Salo Sha'asa Kosher. Now what do those words mean, Shalohai Salo Sha'asa Kosher? There was never a point when the independent components or any component of the system was permitted. From the time that you planted the tree until the time that the fruit comes to fruition, the fruit is always aser. Basar b'chalav is different. Why? Because the individual components, before they cook together, are permitted. And maybe that's a reason to be more lenient by basar b'chalav than by orla. But let me ask you the same question when it comes to kilayim. By kilayim, the lifroch malakilei hakerem shekain lo ha'isa lo sha'asa kosher. By kilayim too, we should make the argument that at no point along the way of this system, when the two objects are combined together, is there going to be a time when the separate components are permitted. Rashi says that our thinking is at this point that the only time that kilayim is an actual forbidden substance is when the actual seed of the wheat seed and the vine are growing together. But there's no isser in planting them together. You can put a seed in the ground, a wheat seed in the ground next to a vine, no problem, at least at this point in the Gemara's thinking. The only time that the substances are forbidden is when they start growing with each other. So therefore, the independent substances are never considered to be having a sha'asa kosher, this time when you mix them, and yet they're still permitted, because they're not even considered to be mixed until they start growing. Once they start growing, they never have a sha'asa kosher. So therefore, they're comparable to orla, and therefore, why doesn't the Brisa say that Kilei HaKerem and Basar B'chalav are dissimilar because Basar B'chalav at least has a Shas HaKosher even after they're combined in a system together, whereas Kilei HaKerem, once they become part of a combined system, they're automatically usher with each other. Amar Ravada bar Ahava, Zos Omeres, Kilei HaKerem Ikara Ne'esarin. Ravada bar Ahava says that what we can derive from the fact that the Brisa does not ask that question is that the Isser of Kilayim begins, or sort of there's a forbidden act of actually planting the wheat seed together with the vine. Hoel v'haisela and shasa kosher kodem hashrasha. And therefore, you create a system of combination from the very moment that you put the wheat seed in the ground next to the vine. That in itself creates the forbidden system. And the prohibition of that forbidden system does not set in until they start growing together. And thus, it is exactly analogous to Basar B'chalav, where you create a combined system once you put the meat and the milk in the pot. And even though they still have a sha'as kosher, they still are permitted until they actually are cooked together. They are still independently permitted until that cooking takes place. And therefore it's analogous to the act of putting the seed in the ground, where the seed and the vine are not forbidden in and of themselves until they actually start growing, but the forbidden act actually begins when I put the seed in the ground. So therefore they are analogous to each other. So Masav Rav Shemaya. So Rav Shemaya challenges that premise. It says in the Brisa, Hamavir otzitz nakuv bekerem, im hosif masayim os aser. We have the following case. I have a flower pot with a wheat seed growing in the flower pot. There are holes underneath the flower pot such that it is nourishing from the soil where the flower pot is resting. If I move this flower pot from an empty field and bring it into a vineyard, so at what point am I in violation of kilayim? So the Brisa says I only am in violation of kilayim once the plant grows 1/200th of its current growth. If it grows 1/200th more of its present status, then I'm in violation. Now, why is it 1 out of 200? Where do we get that number from? The answer is that every Isser has its own share of bittul. You've heard of bittul b'shisha. You've heard of bittul b'meya when we talked about truma. When it comes to the Isser of orla and of kilayim, the Isser is 1 in 200. You have to have 200 times the permitted substance versus the forbidden substance in order to have bittul. So if you have less than 1 in 200th of a growth, so then whatever grew is batal. But once you have more than 1/200th of a growth in the vineyard, so then you've incurred the penalty.
What is growing here?
The plant is growing. The wheat plant is growing.
Well, the flowering is, the pot has just got wheat in it. It's not a flower plus a wheat seed.
It's a flower pot that has a wheat seed growing in it. Good. Okay. So the Gemara says, I couldn't say a wheat pot because then you wouldn't know what that is. So the Gemara says, Hosif in, lo hosif lo. So you see from this that the act of planting is not the forbidden act. In other words, the whole premise of what we were trying to say is that the planting itself is when this system begins, because the act of planting itself in a vineyard is forbidden. And that's the reason why it's analogous to Basar B'chalav, where combining them together is the beginning of this forbidden system, and they still have a Sha'as HaKosher. The seed and the vine are still not prohibited in and of themselves until they start growing, even though the planting itself is the beginning of the prohibition. So the Gemara says, but you see not that way from this brisa, because this brisa implies that only when it starts growing is the prohibition set in, not with the actual act of planting. According to you, just by virtue of putting the potted plant down in the vineyard, you should be doing the Isser. So the Gemara says, Amarava trei kroi ksivi, ksiv hazera ksiv hamaleya. So the answer is, says Rava, well, you have to bifurcate it. When it comes to kilayim, there are 2 psukim. One pasuk is the seed, and another pasuk is the growth. So how do you reconcile? Is it the planting that's usher, or is it the growing that's usher? The way to reconcile it is hakeitzad zarua meikaro bahashrasha, zarua uba hosifin lo hosif lo. The answer is that when you're planting a seed from scratch, the planting itself is part of the prohibition. But when you've already planted a seed in soil, and you're just transporting the seed in a system of soil, so then there's no prohibition of laying it down on a vineyard until it starts growing, because there the seed was already planted, and therefore it's no contradiction. True, when you plant the seed by a vineyard, that in itself begins the prohibited action is the planting, and the substance becomes prohibited once it takes root. But if you've already planted the seed and you transfer the seed and the soil over to a vineyard, then there's nothing prohibited about that until it actually starts growing. Weiter. Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, B'chol misrape in chutz me'atzei ashera. So now Rabbi Yochanan makes a new statement, where this is going to be a little bit more familiar to you. And the halacha is, you're allowed to take a medicinal cure from any substance, except if it's a tree that is used for avodah zarah. If it's an Asherah tree that is used in avodah zarah worship, then you're not allowed to use that tree for a medicinal cure. So heichi dami. So the Gemara says, what kind of medicinal cure are we talking about? Ine mediika sakana filo atzei Asherah nami. If you're telling me that a person's life is in danger, well, then nothing stands in the way of saving a life. So you should be allowed to use even an avodah zarah tree. The idaleka sakana afilu kol yisrin shebatara nami lo. And if there's no danger to life, then why dafka an Asherah tree is usher? You can't use any prohibited substance to administer a cure when there's no danger to life. La'olam de'ika sakana va'afila hachiyatze Asherah lo. The Gemara says no. Here we're talking about it where a person's life is in danger, and the only way he can be cured is if he uses the Asherah tree to cure him. And what the halacha is that no, better that you die than use avodah zarah to cure you. Why? The Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer im nemar b'chol nafshecha lama nemar b'chol meodecha im nemar b'chol meodecha lama nemar b'chol nafshecha. The Torah, when telling me the mitzvah to love Hashem with all your heart and all your might, it says both your heart and your might. Now the word might, meodecha, means with all your money. So why does the Torah have to say both words? If just take the one that is the more important and write that, and I'll know the lesser important by definition. So Ela lomar lecha, it's to tell you, because im yesh adam shegufo chaviv alav mimamonu lekach nemer b'chol nafshecha, v'im yesh adam shemona chaviv alav migufo lekach nemer b'chol meodecha. This is because there are two different kinds of people. There are some people that parting with their money is more difficult than parting with their life. And there are other people that parting with their life is more difficult than parting with their money. And therefore the Torah has to address both people, and it has to tell you that at all costs you must love Hashem, even if that demand of loving Hashem causes you to part with your life. So what does that teach me? That teaches me that anything that is contrary to my love of Hashem and my declaration of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, anything that is contrary to that has to be avoided even at the cost of my life. And therefore we learn, since avodah zarah is the exact antithesis of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, therefore if I have to forfeit my life to avoid avodah zarah, then that's what I'm called upon to do. And that's why I'm not allowed to use the Asherah tree to save my life. Ki asa Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan b'chol misrape in chutz me avodah zarah v'gilei arayos u'shvichus dam. He expands the teaching, Rabin, and he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that you're allowed to cure yourself with anything except for something that involves shvichus damim, involves murder. Let's say you have to kill someone in order to cure yourself. Let's say you need a transplant, and the only way that you can get the transplant is by killing that guy to get his heart to put it inside yourself. So that you're not allowed to do. Avodah zarah and Gili Arayas, and if you have to commit a sexual crime in order to save your life. Gemara gives an example elsewhere. Let's say a person says, I'm so sick psychologically that unless I have relations with that woman, I will not be cured. Even if the doctors can ascertain that that's the case, you're not allowed to do that. So the Gemara says, Avodah Zarah Hada Amran. So we've already established that Avodah Zarah does not come, you're not allowed to, even if it means giving up your life. Gili Arayas U'Shvichus Damim. How do I know both the case of sexual crimes and murder? The Tanya Rabbi Omer Ki Kasher Yakum Ish El Reihu Urtzachon Nefesh Kein Hadavar Hazeh. The Torah talks about the case of rape, and it says that in cases of rape, the girl shall be held blameless. And the Torah then analogizes rape to murder. And it says that just like when a person murders his friend, so too is a rapist who rapes a girl. So the Gemara's question is, why is this analogy presented? What's the comparison? The answer is because we're going to make a bilateral teaching from the case of rape to the case of murder and vice versa. Right? Makish rotzeach lenara hamaoras. Amanara hamaoras anitin lahatzilo benafsho. Af rotzeach nitin lahatzilo benafsho. That so the first teaching is that we learn from the case of rape because the Torah says ve'ein moshiala. You shall hold her blameless because there was no one. She cried out and there was no one that could save her. So we infer from those words, ve'ein moshiala, there was no one that could save her, that if there was someone who could save her, he would be obligated to save her at all costs, even if it means killing the rapist. If the only way to stop the rapist is to kill him, then you have to go ahead and do that. And from that we apply to the case of murder, because the Torah connects them. That if you see someone trying to murder someone else, he's a rodef, and the only way that you can stop the murderer is by killing him, then you have a mitzvah to kill the murderer to avoid him from committing murder. So that's one reason that they're connected, is to learn murder from the law of rape. But we also learn it in the other direction, and we learn something about rape from the case of murder. Just like a murderer has to let himself be killed before, a potential murderer has to let himself be killed before he commits murder, so too a nara ha'me'orasa, in the case of nara ha'me'orasa, a man has to give up his life before called upon to commit an act of rape or any other kind of sexual crime. Okay, so that's the analogy that we're making. So now the question is, how do you know that a person has to give up his life before committing murder? Where do we get that from? Answers the Gemara Svaru. You don't need a pasuk, it's logic. Why is it logic? Ki hahu da'asa lekame derava amar le mari doroi amar li zil katli leplanya v'ilo katil nalach. There was once a man who came before Rava, and he said that the head of my city, the non-Jewish ruler of my city, the Paritz, whatever you want to call him, he told me that I have to go and become his hitman. I have to go and kill someone that he wants to get out of the way, and he told me that if I don't do that, he's going to kill me. So Rabbi, what should I do? Do I have a heter to go ahead and kill the other guy? So Amar lei liktaluch v'lo siktol. My chaz is the dama didach sumak tfei, dilma dama de'ahu gavra sumak tfei. And Rava says, no, you don't have permission to kill the other guy, better that you should die. Because on what basis do you have to presume that your blood is redder than his? Maybe his blood is redder than yours. What does that mean? It means that you cannot do anything proactive in order to make that kind of presumption that my life is more important than his. Right? So therefore, if I'm called upon to do something proactive to make that statement, I have no right to do so, because maybe his life is more important, maybe his blood is more red than mine. So that's the svara. It has to do with the redness of blood or the importance of life. And you see, therefore, that you have no right to presume that my life is more important than somebody else's, and therefore I have no right to kill someone in order to save my own. Once I know that by the case of murder, then I apply that to the case of rape as well, or to any other sexual crime, and I have no right to commit a sexual crime, even if it means losing my life in the process.
Isn't it? It's pretty unusual to me to see the svara, like without a source. Like we're making an assumption based on our own svara.
It's
the Torah is very often.
Svara is even more powerful than mikra, Chazal say, because svara is something that there's consensus that this is what logic dictates. Chazal will many times say, svara hi lama likra. If I have a svara, what do I need a pasuk for? You only need a pasuk when something is counterintuitive, but when it's intuitive, you don't need a pasuk for that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is so universally intuitive. It is so, and it's beyond refutation. There's no one that could potentially argue that there's anything to counteract this kind of argument. So therefore, it's ironclad. Mar baravashi ashkechei laravina deshayif lo lebrate beguharke do'orla. Now another story. Mar baravashi once found Ravina was giving his daughter a salve on her skin that was made from orla produce. And this was surprising to him. He said, Amar lei, Emer damar rabbanon bishasa sakana, shal bishasa sakana mi amar. Chazal only gave us permission to use forbidden substances to save lives. But this is just a salve. It's like a lotion for your daughter's skin. That's not to save her life. So what heter do you have to get benefit from it? So Amarlei, Hai Ishisa Tsamirta Nami Kishasa Sakana Damya. He said to him, my daughter has a fever, and she needs this lotion because otherwise her life will be in danger. This will help her relieve her of her fever. Ika da Amri, Amarlei Midi Derech Ka Avidna. Others learned that Ravina's response was totally different. He said, granted that my daughter's life is not in danger, but the Torah only prohibits hana in a normative fashion, and this is a non-normative hana that I'm getting from this, from the juice of this fruit. And since it's non-normative, I guess maybe it was a type of olive oil, perhaps. Since it's a non-normative benefit, there's no prohibition other than a derabanan, and therefore I'm justified in doing it for my daughter. Itmar. The next statement was made, and with this we'll conclude for the day. Hana haba'alo adam ba'al korcho. If a benefit comes to a person against his will. Now what this means is unclear, but what we're dealing with is a situation where a person is deriving benefit when it wasn't his interest to derive benefit. And he's deriving benefit from a prohibited substance. Let's say I'm walking past the church and the incense from the inside the church is blowing to the outside and it smells fantastic. So that's the situation that we're dealing with, and we're going to qualify it in just a moment. So Abaya Amar Muteres V'Rava Amar Asur. Abaya says it's mutter. Don't worry, you don't have to run away just because you're benefiting from the incense. And Rava says, no, it's Asur, and therefore you have to run away as quickly as possible. So, Efshir v'kami chavein, lo efshir v'kami chavein, kuli alma lo pligi di Asur. So the Gemara just says, let's clarify this. If it's possible for a person to avoid the benefit, and he enjoys it, in other words, he's walking down the street, and he smells the incense, he says, wow, this is geschmack. Geschmack. Wonderful, beautiful, delicious. Right? Or even if he can't avoid it because he was put here and there's no other place to walk, because even if it's such a strong smell, no matter where he goes, he's going to smell it, but it's a geschmack and he loves it, so then he's got to do whatever he can. Everyone agrees that in that situation he's got to do whatever he can to cause the hana to pass as quickly as possible. Okay? Lo efshir v'lo michavein kuli alma lo pligi deshari. And if the hana is unavoidable, and furthermore, he has no intention of benefiting from it, it's not something that he's particularly enjoying or wants to enjoy, since he's got both of those issues, that it was unavoidable, and he has no intention of enjoying this, so then everyone would agree that it's permissible in that situation. Ki pligi de efshir v'lo michavein, the machlokus is going to be where it's possible for him to sidestep the hana completely. In other words, you know that if you walk down that street by that church and you see the smoke coming out of the building, you're going to smell the incense, right? So you could take another direction if you want to. And however, at the same time, you have no intention of benefiting from that incense. That incense is of no interest to you. So that's the case where Abai and Rava argue. You can avoid it to begin with, but you have no interest in it at all. So this is the machlokus. Furthermore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says in the laws of Shabbos that a davar she'eino miskavin is asur, that something that even you don't have intention for is going to be asur, both Abai and Rava will agree that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to be asur here as well to walk down that street where the incense is burning. Ki pligi aliba de Reb Shimon davar she'eino miskavin is mutter. But the machlokus between Abai and Rava is according to Reb Shimon, who says that a davar she'eino miskavin is mutter. When it's not your intent, it's mutter. So therefore, Abai ka Rabbi Shimon, v'Rava, so Abai ka Reb Shimon, Abai tells you, look, Reb Shimon says davar she'eino miskavin is mutter. So here too, I don't care about the incense, so I have no obligation to completely sidestep this church because it's a davar she'eino miskavin. A davar she'eino miskavin is mutter. V'Rava amar ad kan lo ka amar Reb Shimon elahecha de lo efshir, aval hecha de efshir lo. And Rava says no. Reb Shimon only permits you to do a davar she'eino miskavin on Shabbos when you have no other option. But if you have the option of sidestepping the situation completely, you see, if I walk down there, I'm going to smell it, and you have the option of taking another direction or taking a detour, then Rava says even Reb Shimon would agree that you're obligated to do that. Reb Shimon only says a davar she'eino miskavin is mutter, as if there's no other way to go about doing it. and that's why Rava holds what he holds. So we're going to continue this discussion in the Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow, but at least we're down to almost the bottom of Daf Chaf Hey Amud Beis. Have a wonderful day.